a WikiVidi documentaries production. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Enjoy. Leonard Bernstein. Leonard Bernstein was an American composer, conductor, author, music lecturer, and pianist. He was among the first conductors born and educated in the U.S. to receive worldwide acclaim. According to music critic Donal Henahan, he was one of the most prodigiously talented and successful musicians in American history. His fame derived from his long tenure as the music director of the New York Philharmonic, from his conducting of concerts with most of the world's leading orchestras, and from his music for West Side Story, Peter Pan, Candide, Wonderful Town, On the Waterfront, his Mass, and a range of other compositions, including 3 symphonies and many shorter chamber and solo works. Bernstein was the first conductor to give a series of television lectures on classical music, starting in 1954 and continuing until his death. He was a skilled pianist, often conducting piano concertos from the keyboard. He was also a critical figure in the modern revival of the music of Gustav Mahler, the composer he was most passionately interested in. As a composer, he wrote in many styles encompassing symphonic and orchestral music, ballet, film and theatre music, choral works, opera, chamber music and pieces for the piano. Many of his works are regularly performed around the world, although none has matched the tremendous popular and critical success of West Side Story. Early life. He was born Louis Bernstein in Lawrence, Massachusetts, the son of Ukrainian Jewish parents Jenny and Samuel Joseph Bernstein, a hairdressing supplies wholesaler originating from Rovno. His family spent their summers at their vacation home in Sharon, Massachusetts. His grandmother insisted that his first name be Louis, but his parents always called him Leonard, which they preferred. He legally changed his name to Leonard when he was 15, shortly after his grandmother's death. To his friends and many others he was simply known as Lenny. His father, Sam Bernstein, was a businessman and owner of a hair product store in downtown Lawrence on the corners of Amesbury and Essex Streets. Sam initially opposed young Leonard's interest in music. Despite this, the elder Bernstein took him to orchestral concerts in his teenage years and eventually supported his music education. At a very young age, Bernstein listened to a piano performance and was immediately captivated. He subsequently began learning the piano seriously when the family acquired his cousin Lillian Goldman's unwanted piano. Bernstein attended the Garrison Grammar School and Boston Latin School. As a child, he was very close to his younger sister Shirley, and would often play entire operas or Beethoven symphonies with her at the piano. He had a variety of piano teachers in his youth, including Helen Coates, who later became his secretary. After graduation from Boston Latin School in 1935, Bernstein attended Harvard University, where he studied music with, among others, Edward Burlingame Hill and Walter Piston, although he majored in music with a final-year thesis entitled The Absorption of Race Elements into American Music. Bernstein's main intellectual influence at Harvard was probably the aesthetics professor David Proul, whose multidisciplinary outlook on the arts Bernstein shared for the rest of his life. One of his friends at Harvard was philosopher Donald Davidson, with whom he played piano 4 hands. Bernstein wrote and conducted the musical score for the production Davidson mounted of Aristophanes' play The Birds in the original Greek. Bernstein reused some of this music in the ballet Fancy Free. During his time at Harvard he was briefly an accompanist for the Harvard Glee Club. Bernstein also mounted a student production of The Cradle Will Rock, directing its action from the piano as the composer Mark Blitzstein had done at the premiere. Blitzstein, who heard about the production, subsequently became a friend and influence on Bernstein. Bernstein also met the conductor Dimitri Mitropoulos at the time. Although he never taught Bernstein, Mitropoulos' charisma and power as a musician were a major influence on Bernstein's eventual decision to take up conducting. Mitropoulos was not stylistically that similar to Bernstein, but he probably influenced some of Bernstein's later habits, such as his conducting from the keyboard, his initial practice of conducting without a baton, and perhaps his interest in Mahler. The other important influence that Bernstein first met during his Harvard years was composer Aaron Copland, whom he met at a concert and then at a party afterwards on Copland's birthday in 1938. At the party, Bernstein played Copland's piano variations, a thorny work Bernstein loved without knowing anything about its composer until that evening. Although he was not formally Copland's student as such, Bernstein would regularly seek advice from Copland in the following years about his own compositions and would often cite him as his only real composition teacher. After completing his studies at Harvard in 1939, he enrolled at the Curtis Institute of Music in Philadelphia. During his time at Curtis, Bernstein studied conducting with Fritz Reiner, piano with Isabel Vengerova, orchestration with Randall Thompson, counterpoint with Richard Storr, and score reading with René Longy-Michel. Unlike his years at Harvard, Bernstein appears not to have greatly enjoyed the formal training environment of Curtis, although often in his later life he would mention Reiner when discussing important mentors. 1940-1950. After he left Curtis, Bernstein lived in New York. He shared an apartment with his friend Adolph Green and often accompanied Green, Betty Comden, and Judy Holliday in a comedy troupe called The Reviewers who performed in Greenwich Village. He took jobs with a music publisher, transcribing music or producing arrangements under the pseudonym Lenny Amber. In 1940, Bernstein began his study at the Boston Symphony Orchestra's Summer Institute, Tanglewood, in the conducting class of the orchestra's conductor, Serge Koussevitzky. Bernstein's friendships with Copland and Mitropoulos were propitious in helping him gain a place in the class. Other students in the class included Lucas Foss, who also became a lifelong friend. Koussevitzky perhaps did not teach Bernstein much basic conducting technique, but instead became a sort of father figure to him and was perhaps the major influence on Bernstein's emotional way of interpreting music. Bernstein later became Koussevitzky's conducting assistant and would later dedicate his Symphony No. 2, The Age of Anxiety, to him. On November 14, 1943, having recently been appointed assistant conductor to Artur Oginski of the New York Philharmonic Orchestra, he made his major conducting debut at short notice, and without any rehearsal, after guest conductor Bruno Walter came down with the flu. The program included works by Schumann, Miklos Rozsa, Wagner, and Richard Strauss's Don Quixote with soloist Joseph Schuster, solo cellist of the orchestra. Before the concert, Bernstein briefly spoke to Bruno Walter, who discussed particular difficulties in the works he was to perform. The next day, the New York Times carried the story on its front page and remarked in an editorial, "It's a good American success story." The warm, friendly triumph of it filled Carnegie Hall and spread far over the airwaves. He became instantly famous, because the concert was nationally broadcast on CBS Radio, and afterwards Bernstein started to appear as a guest conductor with many U.S. orchestras. From 1945 to 1947, Bernstein was the music director of the New York City Symphony, which had been founded the previous year by the conductor Leopold Stokowski. The orchestra was aimed at a different audience than the New York Philharmonic, with more modern programs and cheaper tickets. Also in regard to a different audience, in 1945 Bernstein discussed the possibility of acting in a film with Greta Garbo, playing Tchaikovsky opposite her starring role as the composer's patron Nadezhda von Meck. In addition to becoming known as a conductor, Bernstein also emerged as a composer in the same period. In January 1944 he conducted the premiere of his Jeremiah Symphony in Pittsburgh. His score to the ballet Fancy Free, choreographed by Jerome Robbins, opened in New York in April 1944, and this was later developed into the musical On the Town with lyrics by Comden and Green that opened on Broadway in December 1944. Bernstein had asthma, which kept him from serving in the military during World War II. After the war, Bernstein's career on the international stage began to flourish. In 1946, he made his overseas debut with the Czech Philharmonic in Prague. He also recorded Ravel's Piano Concerto in G as soloist and conductor with the Philharmonia Orchestra. On July 4, 1946, Bernstein conducted the European premiere of Fancy Free with the Ballet Theatre at the Royal Opera House in London. In 1946, he conducted opera for the first time, with the American premiere at Tanglewood of Benjamin Britten's Peter Grimes, which had been a Koussevitzky commission. That same year, Artur Vittore Toscanini invited Bernstein to guest conduct 2 concerts with the NBC Symphony Orchestra, one of which again featured Bernstein as soloist in the Ravel Concerto. In 1947, Bernstein conducted in Tel Aviv for the first time, beginning a lifelong association with Israel. The next year he conducted an open-air concert for troops at Beersheba in the middle of the desert during the Arab-Israeli War. In 1957, he conducted the inaugural concert of the Mann Auditorium in Tel Aviv. He subsequently made many recordings there. In 1967, he conducted a concert on Mount Scopus to commemorate the reunification of Jerusalem. During the 1970s, Bernstein recorded his symphonies and other works with the Israel Philharmonic for Deutsche Grammophon. On December 10, 1949, he made his first television appearance as conductor with the Boston Symphony Orchestra at Carnegie Hall. The concert, which also included an address by Eleanor Roosevelt, celebrated the one-year anniversary of the United Nations General Assembly's ratification of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and included the premiere of Aaron Copland's preamble, with Sir Laurence Olivier narrating text from the UN Charter. The concert was televised by NBC Television Network. In 1949, he conducted the world premiere of the Turang Galila Symphony by Olivier Messiaen, with the Boston Symphony Orchestra. Part of the rehearsal for the concert was recorded and released by the orchestra. When Koussevitzky died 2 years later, Bernstein became head of the orchestra and conducting departments at Tanglewood. 1951-1959. In 1951, Bernstein conducted the New York Philharmonic in the world premiere of the Symphony No. 2 of Charles Ives, which was written around half a century earlier, but had never been performed. Throughout his career, Bernstein often talked about the music of Ives, who died in 1954. The composer, old and frail, was unable to attend the concert, but his wife did. He reportedly listened to a radio broadcast of it on a radio in his kitchen some days later. A recording of the premiere was released in a 10-CD box set Bernstein Live by the Orchestra, but the notes indicate it was a repeat performance from 3 days later, and this is perhaps what Ives heard. In any case, reports also differ on Ives' exact reaction, but some suggest he was thrilled and danced a little jig. Bernstein recorded the Second Symphony with the orchestra in 1958 for Columbia and 1987 for Deutsche Grammophon. There is also a 1987 performance with the Bavarian Radio Symphony Orchestra available on DVD. Bernstein was a visiting music professor from 1951 to 1956 at Brandeis University, and he founded the Creative Arts Festival there in 1952. He conducted various productions at the first festival, including the premiere of his opera Trouble in Tahiti, and Blitzstein's English version of Kurt Weill's Threepenny Opera. The festival was named after him in 2005, becoming the Leonard Bernstein Festival of the Creative Arts. In 1953 he was the first American conductor to appear at La Scala in Milan, conducting Maria Callas in Cherubini's Medea. This opera had been virtually abandoned by performers and the pair learnt it in a week. It was to prove a fruitful collaboration, and Callas and Bernstein went on to perform together many times. That same year, he produced his score to the musical Wonderful Town at very short notice, working again with his old friends Comden and Green, who wrote the lyrics. In 1954 Bernstein made the first of his television lectures for the CBS Arts program Omnibus. The live lecture, entitled Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, involved Bernstein explaining the work with the aid of musicians from the former NBC Symphony Orchestra and a giant page of the score covering the floor. Bernstein subsequently performed concerts with the orchestra and recorded his Serenade for Violin with Isaac Stern. Further omnibus lectures followed from 1955 to 1958 covering jazz, conducting, American musical comedy, modern music, J.S. Bach, and grand opera. These programs were made available in the US in a DVD set in 2010. In late 1956, Bernstein conducted the New York Philharmonic in concerts that were to have been conducted by Guido Cantelli, who had died in an air crash in Paris. This was the first time Bernstein had conducted the orchestra in subscription concerts since 1951. Partly due to these appearances, Bernstein was named the music director of the New York Philharmonic in 1957, replacing Dmitri Mitropoulos. He began his tenure in that position in 1958, having held the post jointly with Mitropoulos from 1957 to 1958. In 1958, Bernstein and Mitropoulos took the New York Philharmonic on tour to South America. In his first season in sole charge, Bernstein included a season-long survey of American classical music. Themed programming of this sort was fairly novel at that time compared to the present day. Bernstein held the music directorship until 1969, although he continued to conduct and make recordings with the orchestra for the rest of his life and was appointed laureate conductor. He became a well-known figure in the United States through his series of 53 televised young people's concerts for CBS, which grew out of his omnibus programs. His first young people's concert was televised a few weeks after his tenure began as principal conductor of the New York Philharmonic. He became as famous for his educational work in those concerts as for his conducting. The Bernstein Young People's Concerts were the first and probably the most influential series of music appreciation programs ever produced on television, and they were highly acclaimed by critics. Some of Bernstein's music lectures were released on records. A recording of Humor in Music was awarded a Grammy Award for Best Documentary or Spoken Word Recording in 1961. The programs were shown in many countries around the world, often with Bernstein dubbed into other languages. All of them were released on DVD by Kultur Video. Around the time he was appointed music director of the New York Philharmonic, and living opposite Carnegie Hall at the Osborne, Bernstein composed the music for two shows. The first was for the operetta Candide, which was first performed in 1956 with a libretto by Lillian Hellman based on Voltaire's novella. The second was Bernstein's collaboration with the choreographer Jerome Robbins, the writer Arthur Laurent, and the lyricist Stephen Sondheim to produce the musical West Side Story. The first three had worked on it intermittently since Robbins first suggested the idea in 1949. Finally, with the addition of Sondheim to the team, and a period of concentrated effort, it received its Broadway premiere in 1957 and has since proven to be Bernstein's most popular and enduring score. In 1959, he took the New York Philharmonic on a tour of Europe and the Soviet Union, portions of which were filmed by CBS television. A highlight of the tour was Bernstein's performance of Dmitri Shostakovich's Fifth Symphony, in the presence of the composer, who came on stage at the end to congratulate Bernstein and the musicians. In October, when Bernstein and the orchestra returned to the US, they recorded the symphony for Columbia. He recorded it for a second time with the orchestra on tour in Japan in 1979. Bernstein seems to have limited himself to only conducting certain Shostakovich symphonies, namely the numbers 1, 5, 6, 7, 9, and 14. He made two recordings of Shostakovich's Leningrad Symphony, one with the New York Philharmonic in the 1960s and another recorded live in 1988 with the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. 1960-1969. In 1960, Bernstein and the New York Philharmonic held a Mahler Festival to mark the centenary of the composer's birth. Bernstein, Walter and Mitropoulos conducted performances. The composer's widow, Alma, attended some of Bernstein's rehearsals. In 1960, Bernstein also made his first commercial recording of a Mahler symphony. And over the next 7 years he made the first complete cycle of recordings of all 9 of Mahler's completed symphonies. The success of these recordings, along with Bernstein's concert performances and television talks, was an important, if not vital, part of the revival of interest in Mahler in the 1960s, especially in the US and the non-US. Composers that Bernstein championed to some extent at the time include the Danish composer Carl Nielsen and Jean Sibelius, whose popularity had by then started to fade. Bernstein eventually recorded a complete cycle in New York of Sibelius symphonies and 3 of Nielsen's symphonies, as well as conducting recordings of his violin, clarinet and flute concertos. He also recorded Nielsen's Third Symphony with the Royal Danish Orchestra after a critically acclaimed public performance in Denmark. Bernstein championed U.S. composers, especially those that he was close to like Aaron Copland, William Schumann, and David Diamond. He also started to more extensively record his own compositions for Columbia Records. This included his 3 symphonies, his ballets, and the symphonic dances from West Side Story with the New York Philharmonic. He also conducted an LP of his 1944 musical On the Town, the first complete recording of the original featuring several members of the original Broadway cast, including Betty Comden and Adolph Green. Bernstein also collaborated with the experimental jazz pianist and composer Dave Brubeck, resulting in the recording Bernstein Plays Brubeck Plays Bernstein. In one oft-reported incident, in April 1962 Bernstein appeared on stage before a performance of the Brahms Piano Concerto No. 1 in D minor with the pianist Glenn Gould. During rehearsals, Gould had argued for tempi much broader than normal, which did not reflect Bernstein's concept of the music. Bernstein gave a brief address to the audience starting with, "Don't be frightened. Mr. Gould is here," and going on to, "In a concerto, who is the boss, the soloist or the conductor? The answer is, of course, sometimes the one and sometimes the other, depending on the people involved." This speech was subsequently interpreted by Harold C. Schoenberg, music critic for the New York Times, as abdication of personal responsibility and an attack on Gould, whose performance Schoenberg went on to criticize heavily. Bernstein always denied that this had been his intent, and has stated that he made these remarks with Gould's blessing. In the book Dinner with Lenny, published in October 2013, author Jonathan Cott provided a thorough debunking, in the conductor's own words, of the legend which Bernstein himself described in the book as one that won't go away. Throughout his life, he professed admiration and friendship for Gould. Schoenberg was often harshly critical of Bernstein as a conductor during his tenure as music director. However, his views were not shared by the audiences and probably not by the musicians themselves. In 1962 the New York Philharmonic moved from Carnegie Hall to Philharmonic Hall in the new Lincoln Center. The move was not without controversy, because of acoustic problems with the new hall. Bernstein conducted the gala opening concert featuring vocal works by Mahler, Beethoven, and Vaughan Williams, and the premiere of Aaron Copland's Connotations, a serial work that was merely politely received. During the intermission Bernstein kissed the cheek of the president's wife Jacqueline Kennedy, a break with protocol that was commented on at the time. In 1961 Bernstein had conducted at President John F. Kennedy's pre-inaugural gala, and he was an occasional guest in the White House. Years later he conducted at the funeral mass in 1968 for President Kennedy's brother Robert Kennedy, featuring the Adagietto from Mahler's Fifth Symphony. On November 23, 1963, the day after the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, Leonard Bernstein conducted the New York Philharmonic and the Schola Cantorum of New York in a nationally televised memorial featuring the Resurrection Symphony by Gustav Mahler. This was the first televised performance of the complete symphony. Mahler's music had never been performed for such an event, and since the tribute to JFK, Mahler symphonies have become part of the standard repertoire for national mourning. In 1964 Bernstein conducted Franco Zeffirelli's production of Verdi's Falstaff at the Metropolitan Opera in New York. In 1966 he made his debut at the Vienna State Opera conducting Luchino Visconti's production of the same opera with Dietrich Fischer-Dieskau as Falstaff. During his time in Vienna he also recorded the opera for Columbia Records and conducted his first subscription concert with the Vienna Philharmonic featuring Mahler's Das Lied von der Erde with Fischer-Dieskau and James King. He returned to the State Opera in 1968 for a production of Der Rosenkavalier and in 1970 for Otto Schenk's production of Beethoven's Fidelio. 16 years later, at the State Opera, Bernstein conducted his sequel to Trouble in Tahiti, A Quiet Place, with the ORF Orchestra. Bernstein's final farewell to the State Opera happened accidentally in 1989. Following a performance of Modest Mussorgsky's Kovanshina, he unexpectedly entered the stage and embraced conductor Claudio Abbado in front of a cheering audience. With his commitment to the New York Philharmonic and his many other activities, Bernstein had little time for composition during the 1960s. The two major works he produced at this time were his Kaddish Symphony dedicated to the recently assassinated President John F. Kennedy and the Chichester Psalms. which he produced during a sabbatical year he took from the Philharmonic in 1965 to concentrate on composition. To make more time to composition was probably a major factor in his decision to step down as music director of the Philharmonic in 1969, and to never again accept such a position elsewhere. Brought to you by WikiVidi Documentaries. Would you like to know more?